everybody. How are we today? It is beautiful outside, so thank y'all for being here. We have Aaron and Ruth Martin who's going to present on their interactions with the Carters. You may have heard a little bit already from their previous talk regarding Habitat for Humanity. So if you could please help me in welcoming Aaron and Ruth.
You see here a picture of Jimmy Carter, and it's probably one of the few times that we saw him dressed so formally. That's not the way we normally saw Jimmy Carter, nor the way he normally was either. Well, in the White House, I'm sure he was. It was the spring of 1987 when it was in March of 1987 when we signed up for our first experience with Habitat for Humanity. It turns out that this experience in 1987 in Charlotte was the fourth of the Habitat projects. The Carters had gone to a renovation project in New York City twice, and they had one session in Chicago, and then they had the session in Charlotte that we signed up for, which Ruth almost backed out of, but fortunately the boys didn't let her. We'd replaced, just to fill in a little bit of the story, the boys came home from college and said we needed to replace our house roof. Ruth got up in the house and was scared spitless of getting next to the roof, and she came down off the roof and said, "I'm not going to go to Charlotte and make a fool of myself." At which point the boys said, "Mom, you always told us that if we said we were going to do something, we were going to do it." So we went to Charlotte. And frankly, when we signed up, I wondered whether we would encounter or see the Carters. Our bus got us there on a Sunday afternoon, and the Carters came in and we saw them. But so you see somebody off at a distance. The question was, what kind of encounter would there be? Well, our first encounter with the Carters was the next morning at breakfast. We had traveled from, our oldest and youngest son joined us there in the Charlotte project, and we went on the bus, and that Monday morning, the first day of the Charlotte project, we went to breakfast with two other people from Pennsylvania on the bus. We didn't really know them, but we got a table together. And it was a table for 8. We sat down at the table, and pretty soon in comes a guy with a whole lot of energy, more than most people have at that early hour of the morning. He plunked his tray right down beside me, and he said, "Hi, I'm Jimmy Carter from Georgia. Where you all from?" So the question whether we would meet the Carters was answered very quickly and in a rather amazing fashion. So we had breakfast together at that table and got to know him a little bit. And a few moments after we were all 5 of us sitting there at the table, our youngest son Tim came in, spotted me, and brought his tray over to put it down beside me. Now, to fully appreciate this, when Tim was doing construction, let's say he didn't dress very formally. He would rip the sleeves off his shirt, have pant legs torn off, and that's the way Tim dressed for work. Tim put his tray down and then noticed who else was sitting at the table, and Tim got awake. So we had that very interesting, that was our first encounter with the Carters. And I'm going to let Ruth tell you about her first encounter with Rosalind, because that happened. So.
Things were a little bit hairy there. We were housed in a very old college dorm, Queens College in Charlotte. It was by no means upper crust, but both Millard and Virginia and Jimmy and Rosalind were on the same floor, in the same place as everybody else. There was no bells and whistles. And in fact, I had an even less formal introduction because I first met Charlotte, met Rose in Charlotte. My first met Rosalind was when we were both standing in line for the shower. Because in those days, you know, college didn't have their own. It was down the hall. Well, we were down the hall from both Millard and Linda and Jimmy and Rosalind, and half a dozen or so other people. But it was a bit of a different introduction, if I may say.
So that was our introduction to Jimmy and Rosalind. We saw them throughout the week. They were there for the entire week, and Jimmy was working in the house just like the rest of us were. We met another one of the Carter family, a couple of the others. On the house, our oldest son, Dan, was working on the house next to the one we were working on. And one time at lunch, he said, "Mom and Dad, you've got to meet this other woman. Their family's just as crazy as ours." And the family was the family of Sybil. And it was Sybil we didn't pay much attention to. Found out it was Sybil Carter, Billy Carter's wife. So we had so much fun with Sybil and her daughter. We interacted quite often at lunch, so we interacted with them rather frequently. That and felt fairly close to them. Our second encounter with the Carter family was when we were there in the dormitory, Millard and Linda were housed just across from us. And if you ever encountered Millard Fuller, he was a genius at pulling people in. That, I would say, was his top skill. And if you can imagine, for kids who lived in really a pretty terrible condition, getting a new house was pretty exciting for them and pretty uplifting. And while the kids were not present on the house that we were working on, they were present in the house next door where Dan and Sybil were working. And I noticed their absolute enthusiasm. Now, for any of you who've ever been teachers, you know that the biggest challenge of all in teaching is to get people turned on. If they are turned on, you can do anything with them. And the kids were so excited that one evening in the dormitory, after watching their excitement, I said to Millard, "Millard, have you ever considered bringing educators into the Habitat community to capitalize on the momentum of the new house?" And Millard responded in a way that we later discovered was standard Millard Fuller. He said, "That's a wonderful idea. Why don't you come down to Americus and do it?" Well, it turns out that I was eligible for a sabbatical, and while we pursued another option, that one didn't develop and this one did. So we took advantage of it, and we spent the following year, it was in '87 that we were at the Carter Project. The '88-'89 school year I had the sabbatical, and we went down to the headquarters at Americus to work on that concept. Well, shortly after we got down to, we were building from Maine to Georgia, and we saw Carters a couple times but didn't interact with them during that journey. But when we got down to Americus, shortly after we got there, Billy Carter died. Now, it turns out that Billy is famous for Billy Beer and a bunch of other ridiculous things. But what most people never learned, did you know that Billy was sober for the last 10 years of his life? Not only was he sober, but he was working with Alcoholics Anonymous to get other, and that didn't, the press didn't pick that up. But that is part of Billy's life and an important part. Well, when we got there right after Billy's death, we debated, should we go to the memorial service or not? It was an outdoor service in the cemetery. But we had appreciated Sybil, so we decided we would go. And then what do you wear for an outdoor memorial service? Well, again, being Jimmy's brother, dignitaries were there from all over the country, suit and tie and so on. I didn't think that that was what Billy would want, so I put on a nice Spanish shirt at Guadalajara, and we stood toward the background of the service. And the MC, one of the first things that he said was, "Gentlemen, the deceased has requested that all gentlemen take off their coats and ties." I said, "Yes!" I said, I thought I knew Billy better than that, and it turns out that my decision was correct. Well, we didn't think much of it. We were standing at the back of the crowd. But at the end of memorial service, when the family was driving out, Sybil had her car stopped and came out and recognized us. So it was important that we went there. So that was our next encounter with the Carter family. That was in fall of 1988. Our next encounter, we always wanted to find a church, and so when we were there in Americus, we visited a number of the churches, but nothing felt right. A number of the churches were segregated, and that didn't fit with us. So we knew that sometime we wanted to visit the Carter's church, but we didn't want to go as tourists. But finally, after not finding a place, I think it was probably about October, we decided that we would go and visit their church, and the also at the Charlotte Project, Ruth did interact with Rosalind, and the wife of the homeowner was short, so we made a stool for her, and Ruth is holding the stool there for Rosalind to sign. But about our experience at church. It's about 10 miles from Americus to Plains. And as you drive into Plains, there's the big Peanut. And of course, Peanut, Billy and Jimmy both worked with, and so did their dad, worked with the peanut farm. They bought seeds, they had a peanut shelling mill, and they did a lot. And Jimmy was recognized for the large peanut. But at church, the church was Maranatha Baptist Church. Maranatha was begun because as the Baptist church, they resisted having a church that was segregated. Jimmy was very, very strong on integration. In fact, when he was elected governor of Georgia, one of his first statements was that the days of segregation are over. And when Jimmy was working at the peanut warehouse, some neighbors came in and said, look, we have this group of citizens that are sticking together. It was clearly a segregation group. They said, we would like you to join. And Jimmy said, no way. He said, I will take $5 and flush it down the toilet, but I won't join the organization. So he was very strong in that. Not only did we go to Maranatha, one of the things we discovered was that Jimmy's Sunday school class, and that's what it looked like on Sunday morning. Jimmy taught the Sunday school class when he was there, and tourists would come like crazy and fill up the church. What we enjoyed, Jimmy was not really an excellent Bible scholar, but he knew his Bible very well. And his world experience, coupled with his biblical knowledge, those two made the class very delightful. And he would always agree to meet anybody who wanted a picture with him afterwards. We didn't need that, but many people did. However, there was the Sunday evening service, and we attended the Sunday evening service, and that was the intimate group, and the tourists weren't there, and we had a very, very delightful time. So we interacted very, very significantly after that. Our main thing when we went down to Americus was to see what could be done to enrich the academic life of the kids. So we visited schools, we visited virtually all the homes, and I think there were about 50 Habitat homes. And as we visited the homes, what amazed us, and it really did amaze us, our kids cut their teeth on books. When we got into the Habitat homes, frequently there were no books in the house. And we couldn't imagine how in the world that was possible. But what happened is that frequently, and it was often just the mothers in the house, frequently they couldn't read. So if you can't read, are you going to buy books for your kids? Well, in talking with the teachers and visiting the families, we decided to put together a program of educational enrichment, and what we did is we meet with the kids after school, in a double-phase program. One part of it, a lot of them were mothers on welfare, so they didn't have employment. So we decided that the kids needed to be exposed to employment opportunities. So we arranged through Hattie, who Ruth worked with very closely. In fact, Ruth called Hattie her boss. And we would have people from the fire department, from grocery stores, from the bank, and so on, come in and just talk about what they did. And just to give them an idea of possible employment. And after the other aspect of the program was a reading program to try to get books into the home. And it may have been the Carters that led us in contact, but there was some relatively wealthy donor bought books for us that we were able to give to the kids. However, in order to earn the books, the kids had to come to the reading program, and they had to read to the volunteer. The volunteer didn't read to them. They had to read to the volunteer, who would help them if necessary. But in the process of participating in the after-school program, the kids could earn books of their own. And it was very fascinating because, as I said, some of the kids had not had books before. Initially, they would, after just a couple sessions, they would get their first book, and then it was a little longer, a few more times before they could earn the next. But in the process, they ended up with quite a few books getting into their home. What was fascinating, we lived in the Habitat neighborhood, and it was not at all unusual that when we would walk home after our day at the office, we would see the kids sitting on the porch reading to their mothers. And it really was pretty amazing. But after we'd gone out to Maranatha a number of times, I don't know whether it was Ruth's idea or mine, we decided to ask whether the Carters would come and also share in the kids program. And they agreed to. And then we also, and it wasn't unusual for us to invite one of the guests to stay for dinner, so we asked whether they would consider staying for dinner. So we'll show you our next encounter. Carters came, they spoke about their work worldwide, and I'll tell you a little more about some of their work later. Jimmy and Rosalind both spoke, and as you see, he's not dressed very formally there. He was showing a book on The President Builds a House, speaking more about their work. Kids were fascinated. Then a couple of the kids had the chance to have the Carters listen to them read. I would love to speak to those kids now and see how they remember that experience. But Jimmy and Rosalind both sat down and had the kids read the books to them. What a special privilege it must have been to have Carter put his arm around the little girl and listen to her read. And Rosalind. After that program, I think it was the school asked them to write, "If I were president of the United States, I would." And these are not all the responses, but I thought some of them, I thought they were particularly cute. stop nuclear bombs because they destroy the world, have drug dealers put in jail. I'd give people a home, feed the poor, put them in a house. I would let the rules be the same. I would love everybody, help them build houses. And I particularly liked, I would run away. Those were some of the responses that the kids had. So after that, we had them over to dinner. And as we were walking down the street, we told our 4 boys, and we said, the Carters are coming for dinner, you may come too if you wish. Well, our youngest son, who was in Indiana, decided that this was too good a chance to miss, so he drove from Indiana down to Americus for dinner that evening. And Tim is the 4th one from the right, and the kids just flocked around the Carters as they were walking home. So we had them to dinner. Carters were incredibly gracious guests. Just like, well, they are who they say they are. That, yes, he had unusual opportunities and unusual experience, but they were who they said they were. In fact, I think I'll always remember Ruth had made a broccoli salad, and as she finished the salad and was getting ready for the dessert, she was picking up the dish of the broccoli salad, and just like somebody else might do, Jimmy reached in the bowl before and grabbed a piece of the broccoli salad. Well, so some of us have done that kind of thing, and that's the kind of people that they were. This was in late May that they were for dinner, and oh yes, I of course didn't take that photograph. Before they came, the Secret Service had to check out our shack. The place where we were living was the first house that had been rehabilitated by Habitat, and it probably needed rehabilitation again. In fact, I suspect by now it's torn down. We would hear the squirrels bowling with pecans in the attic. For some reason, the ants would drop their dead ants in our bathtub that we always had to rinse out. But and the Secret Service had to check it out beforehand. We invited the Secret Service to dinner, but they were not allowed to. But anyway, as I said, that was in late May. Our next encounter with the Carters, well, here's the thank you note that Rosalind sent. We enjoyed visiting with the Habitat children and especially enjoyed being in your home for the delicious meal. We were pleased to meet Tim too. Give him our thanks for the beautiful pottery vase. We will treasure it. Tim, as you know, had the pottery here earlier, and I'm not sure, not far from Americus, there's Providence Canyon, and there's natural clay that is very high quality. Tim might have made a vase out of that. I'm not sure what the gift was. I'll have to ask Tim sometime. Our next encounter with the Carters was again in May of 1989. The Charlotte Habitat dedicated a playground for the children in the Habitat neighborhood, and it was called the Jimmy Carter Park. So we went up for the dedication as well. Carters. Yeah, the Secret Service dressed formally, but Carters didn't. It was sometime after this that Dan was graduating from graduate school in California. We were going out to California for his graduation. I had a telescope along that I had used a few times, and we left the telescope at Sybil's residence, which was right next to Jimmy, so that Jimmy could help Billy and Sybil's son, Earl, use the telescope. Jimmy was highly responsible and helped Earl a great deal after Billy had died. So Jimmy assumed a lot of the father responsibilities. At some time later, when Dan was back in the area, stopped by Sybil, and Jimmy needed something moved in the basement or something, so just came over and asked Dan to help. That kind of interaction was fairly normal. One of our last Sundays in Americus, Sybil invited us to dinner. We were the honored guests. Jimmy and Rosalind were there as well. It seemed like it was a little out of whack for us to be the honored guests, but we had a delightful time. In the afternoon, Jimmy asked us on Sybil's property and Jimmy's property were adjacent to each other, so you could walk through the back fence from one into the other. And there was a pond on Jimmy's property. We had had a pond in our place in Pennsylvania, and one of the problems if you have a pond is algae. And so we were discussing algae problems, and so Jimmy said, well, let's come over and look at the pond. So we walked over, and on the way, there was a bluebird house. Bluebirds around here too. So Jimmy stopped and at the bluebird house, opened up the top and looked down in. The bluebird just looked up at him, didn't fly away. Apparently Jimmy had done that so much that the bluebird had gotten to know him and wasn't bothered by it. So we all looked in on the bluebird house and we saw the pond problems and discussed it together. But I had a question. How do you know who to vote for in elections? I think we all agree that we want to vote for the best candidates. And I've always had a little bit of a struggle to say, okay, now how do I really find out who's the best candidate? Where do I go for information? And I thought, boy, if I can ever ask anybody, the Carters might be the person to ask. So in the course of the conversation after dinner, the opportunity came around, so I popped the question. And I said, how can I know who to vote for intelligently? Rosalind immediately answered, on how you can know, she said, you can't. And Jimmy never contradicted her. Rather sobering. Because I think, personally, I really think that happened this last election. You may disagree with me, but I don't think people voted this last election for who they got. I think they got somebody different from what they voted for. Because I think Trump was promising that certain things that have not happened. And so that was sobering. But it was an important dinner and a beautiful time together. The last Sunday that we were there at Americus, as I said, we always went to the Sunday evening service. We went to the morning service too, but why more tourists didn't come, I don't know, but nobody tried to get the tourists because the Sunday morning was mobbed when Jimmy was there, but Sunday evening was just informal family gang, and we had participated quite a lot with the church. They always began the service with hymn sing. And Hugh Carter, Jimmy's uncle, first, second, and last verse. that was his style. But on that particular occasion, they'd always ask for requests. And Jimmy requested that the group sing, "Blessed be the tie that binds," and he said, "in honor of Ruth and Aaron." We've sung that song a number of times, but I'm telling you, that song sounds quite different to us now. It's almost impossible not to tear up when we think about that song that they recognized us in such a fashion. Our next encounter was with the Women's House in 1991. And I'm going to let Ruth tell you a little bit about the experience with the Women's House. Oh, from after a sabbatical year in '89, we did go on a number of other Carter work camps. In fact, quite a few of them before they started taking, and we always saw the Carters then and would say hi and so on. But we didn't really interact very much during those. This was the T101, and you can see Jimmy and Rosalind there. And it wasn't unusual that they were signing books and so on. And we do consider it a privilege to have a number of signed Carter books that we will hang on to. But now to the Women's House.
We were kind of adopted people to the folks at Charlotte Habitat because they had been the beginning of our being together, and we were close, but we tried to get a place in Charlotte. So
yeah, if I could have gotten a job in Charlotte, we wouldn't have been here in Greensboro.
But we didn't find one. So, but we were sort of the adopted people in Charlotte, and when they had something neat going on, they let us know, and we'd come down. We were only an hour or two away. Well, Charlotte was celebrating their 100th house, and to
They were building one house.
they were going to build a house in one day, 24 hours, to celebrate their 100th house that they were, so big whoop-de-doo. And they invited us to come along, and we did.
You have to recognize that that's a little bit of a misnomer, because it's like putting together a big jigsaw puzzle. Components are built.
They have everything you have everything laid out in piles of what goes where, and so it's not really starting from scratch.
But they did
But
succeed.
it looks like it's scratch.
Well, and they did succeed and finished it, and including electrical, drywall, the whole bit. They did it in 24 hours.
And we were, a bunch of us were sitting around congratulating ourselves on having done this 100th house in one 24-hour week. And one of the girls said, what, you know, they were saying, what do you, after you do it on a single day, 100, what do you do for an encore? And one of the girls said, you know, I would bet that we'd have enough talent here that we could make one with all girls. And we all jumped on her like nobody's business. Yeah, nobody's done that before. They have now, but they hadn't then. And and I said, well, we were just back from doing things in Americas. So you know, I bet that if we asked her, Charlotte or Rosalind or Sybil, or both of them, would come and join us, because they were both as crazy as we were. Well, this was Rosalind's response. And she came, and we had a drop-dead wonderful time. We didn't do it in a day, but we had the first in the kind. There's other places that have done it now, but the Charlotte group had the very first Habitat house built entirely by women, with 4 women alone with 2 daughters. And it was a fantastic opportunity for everybody.
Tell a little more about the way you got trusses up, the way you done up trusses
Oh yeah, one of the girls had worked as construction. Well, 3 of them actually had worked with construction before, and we were wondering how in the world you were going to get trusses up, because we didn't have anybody very strong around. Well, Clara, that's not who's in the picture. She was something else. She had her own construction company, but well, let's just say was a little more adventurous than most of the rest of us were. But she invented a pulley arrangement where we could shove it over where it belonged, and then put it on the pulley and take it up to the top, and it worked. It worked fine.
And there's also the outhouse.
Oh, yeah. No girls were allowed.
No, men were.
No, no men were allowed. Yeah. And, except we had one little bit of a problem because the regulations in Charlotte have to have an inspection. So the county inspector was the only man allowed, but he had a big hat with worms. Yeah, for a wig. And he had to wear his mop anytime he came to if you've been on a construction site, you've also seen the nice little necessary houses for them to use as necessary. Well, what we're going to do with that. One of the girls brought a lovely pot of geraniums, which we installed in the portion of the outhouse that we didn't need.
Okay. That's the three grandmas that were present. Wait a minute. Yeah, that is our daughter-in-law with our oldest granddaughter, along with Rosalind, working that day. And this was Rosalind's response. What a wonderful time together in Charlotte. I love being with you in the women's house. It's special and fun. Everyone asks about it wherever I go. Give my love to Aaron too. I was so glad to get to see him and your grandbaby and children. With much love and best wishes, Rosalind Carter. Later there was a year or so later, there was another woman's house in D.C., and
not to be outdone, the Habitat, there was a year or two later in D.C., had a women's house all at the same time, and engineered by a group of us from Charlotte. And of course, being in DC, they had to be very careful about everything, with all the bells and whistles of being properly safe. And oh yeah. So when I was, they gave me a hard time because I was up on the roof doing something. I don't remember what I was doing when word went out. Everybody has to get down and out of the way because the Carters and everybody else was, the big Washington bigwigs were walking down the street. I didn't get the message. And I was up behind something up on the roof. And somebody hollered and said, hey, we were supposed to all be down. And one of the Secret Service guys who had known us from Habitat days said, they don't worry about you, they know you.
That was in 1991, our last encounter with Carters. Millard Fuller died in February of 2009. We went to Atlanta for the memorial service, and we interacted with Carter's there. But to understand and appreciate Carter's, his statement, I think, summarizes it best. This is what Jimmy himself has said, and you notice that he's not in a suit and tie. My faith demands that I do whatever I can, wherever I can, whenever I can, for as long as I can, with whatever I have to try to make a difference. And that is the Jimmy Carter that we knew. And let me simply close by adding one little tidbit that some of you may or may not be aware of. Carter's at the Carter Center decided to take on projects of worldwide significance, one of which is elimination of diseases. So what disease did they take on? Some of the neglected ones, one of which is the guinea worm. How many of you heard of the guinea worm? Okay, a few of you have. The guinea worm is a parasite. It lays its eggs in the water. People drink the water. The larvae hatch inside the human body, develop into a worm that's about 1 meter long. And when it's mature, it very slowly eats its way out through the flesh. It's very, very painful. And you can't take a hold of it and just pull it out, because if you do, it will break. And then you have the remnants left inside. So Carter, and the problem was, when it's emerging, it's so painful that to relieve the pain, people go back into water. And that's exactly what the guinea worm wants, because it lays the eggs and starts a cycle all over again. There were literally millions of cases, and Carter's decided to take that on. From millions of cases, it's now down to less than a half dozen. We were completely disappointed because we wanted to see Jimmy stump the last guinea worm with his boot. If it happens, when it happens, it'll be the second after smallpox to be a disease that's eliminated. And we contribute to make sure that happens. There's also river blindness and a number of other things. But this statement, if you want to know who the Carters are, that represents. Well, that's our experience. Any questions that anybody has? Yeah.
I have a question.
Sure.
I've always wondered about celebrities and politicians that go out and they pretend, or do they really work on these houses and other projects? I think they did, apparently.
They did.
But do you know about others? Is it strictly a photo opportunity?
This was never a photo opportunity. On the last Habitat house we worked on, we were in the same house that Jimmy was on. Jimmy doesn't want photographs. Jimmy wants to work. That's who Jimmy is. Now, I can't speak to Jimmy and Rosalind are the only ones that we know. And I think probably, I'm sure it varies. I wouldn't place many bets on our current president. Any other questions? Well, thank you so much, and thank you for allowing us to share. And if any of you want to know more about our Habitat experience, we can share it with you as well. Thank you.
Thank you.